I won't lie, this is a little more difficult of a topic to go through, but there's no talking about Europe in general and the Germans in particular without saying something about World War II because of the profound impact it had on the planet. We don't have the United Nations or the European Union or NATO without it. And of course, this impact that it had on Germany itself, which was deep and lasting. So, what happened in the war in general? Here's World War II in a few seconds. Hitler came to power in an election in 1933. That's right, he was elected. And by most people's standards, it was a relatively fair election. Then, from 1939 to 1945, the war broke out. And of course, it ends in 1945. Germany, as a result of its actions in the war, was destroyed by the time the war was ended. Really, cities were smoking rubble. And, of course, there were three significant outcomes as a result of their actions during the war for Germany. Here's what they were. There was a geographical impact, there was a political impact, and, of course, there was a psychological impact. We're going to focus on the geographical impact because this is a geography class, but I'm going to say a little bit about the other two as well. So we'll start with the geography. At the end of World War II, Germany was split into two countries. The idea fundamentally was to keep them from ever starting another war. They were the primary instigators of World War I, and clearly they were the main player in World War II in terms of aggression. So the idea was stop this from happening so we don't have World War III. And the country was split into these two parts. East Germany, which fell under the influence of the Soviet Union, the Russians. It became communist, non-democratic, and economically stagnant. Now, I will say that East Germany was probably the most vigorous economy of the communist East European countries, but still by Western standards, it was economically stagnant. And West Germany, which fell primarily under the influence of the United States and became capitalist, democratic, and economically vigorous. This is a terrible map, and I apologize for that, but it does the job, which is shows you what happened at the end of World War II, which was over on the right-hand side, that pinkish reddish color, whatever color you want to call that, indicates the movement of the Soviet military and where they went to and what they occupied after the war. The way the war ended was this. Of course, the Germans spread out all over the place in Europe, and then the Allies, primarily the United States, the British, I guess France to some extent, and the Soviet Union are going to push the Germans back. And whoever army ends up on your territory, in most cases, you are going to end up falling under their influence after World War II. So you can see that all of Eastern Europe falls under the influence of the Soviet Union because it becomes communist as a result of that. And Germany itself gets split by the Allies, by the United States, the British, the French, and the Russians. This is what the occupation of Germany looked like after World War II. The green represents the area the British were under control of. The blue represents French control. The yellowish bronze indicates American control. And then the red is Russian control, Soviet control. Then notice, this is critically important, where Berlin is. Berlin is circled there on the upper right-hand corner. And you can see that Berlin sits right in the middle of what was going to become East Germany, communist East Germany. And notice that all the colors are there. The Soviet color, the French color, the British color, and the American color are all in Berlin. So when it's all settled up, Germany gets split into West Germany, which is the reddish color there, and then East Germany, which is the greenish color. That's the split between these two countries. And the border was more or less impenetrable. You weren't allowed to go in either direction, especially if you were a German. Now, I passed the border twice. As an American, you were allowed to go across it. But there was a lot of hassle, and it was a fascinating, crazy, weird, and interesting time, and a crazy, wild, fascinating, interesting thing to do at that time. But they really did not like Germans going back and forth across that border, and East Germans were definitely not allowed to go to West Germany. Berlin itself was divided just like the country was divided. And what ended up happening was this. East Berlin became the capital of communist East Germany, whereas West Berlin was a part of Free West Germany. So, in other words, West Berlin was completely surrounded by a communist country, but it was a free and open society. Listen to what you want to listen to, say what you want to say, read what you want to read, leave when you want to leave. Okay? That was West Berlin. East Berlin, dark, gray, dictatorial, totalitarian, and communist. Same city. And literally the border between these things sometimes was alleyways and streets. So West Berlin became what's known as an enclave. An enclave is a part of one country that's completely surrounded by another country. West Berlin was completely surrounded by communist East Germany. Now, what began to happen, of course, was people from East Berlin began to run across the street or the alley and escape into West Berlin. Because of that, the Soviet Union and the East German Communist government built the very famous Berlin Wall to encircle West Berlin and keep people from escaping to freedom in West Berlin. Now, at the same time, I told you that West Germany became capitalist, democratic, and economically vigorous. But the population had been smashed as a result of the war. There was not a high birth rate after the war. And the West German economy by the 1960s and 70s became so vigorous, there were not really enough Germans to supply the number of jobs they were creating. So they had to make a decision. The decision basically was this: let the economy cool off, which nobody wants to do, or import workers. And so that's what they did. And these people they imported are known as Gastarbeiters, which literally means guest worker. And they came originally from three places: Italy, the former Yugoslavia. Although it was communist, it was a relatively open communist country. They had broken with the Soviet Union by then. And Turkey. I was in West Germany many times during that era. Nobody cared about it at all. Nobody could care less about these other people who were living there. They were fine. Everybody was making money. And when everybody's making money, people are usually okay. Take a look at this map. This is Berlin. And you can see this is the division of Berlin into West Berlin and East Berlin. The red is East Berlin. That was the capital of communist East Germany. And then the bronze color was West Berlin. And you can see that there are the three sectors there, which is the French sector, the British sector, and the American sector, which means those three countries, along with the Soviet Union, the Russians, occupied Berlin and maintained an occupation force in Berlin. But West Berlin was part of West Germany and was free, fair, open, capitalist, democratic, whereas East Berlin was communist. And all of Berlin was surrounded by East Germany, and that, of course, includes West Berlin. The dotted line that you see there demarcates the Berlin Wall. So literally, West Berlin was encircled by this wall that was built by the communists to keep the people from East Germany from escaping into West Berlin and having freedom. Well, I was there during that era, and I had the crappiest camera in the world. I know I'm recording, I shouldn't say that word, but it was a terrible little camera, and I was a young person. But you can see the Berlin Wall off there in the distance. I'm in West Berlin because you were not allowed to paint on the wall or tag the wall on the East German side, or they'd shoot you. But on the West German side, they just let you do whatever you wanted to do. It was a form of protest. And if you look just over the wall, you can see the guard tower for the East Germans. So literally, this is a split between these two countries, a dark, gray, dictatorial communist country. And I was in East Berlin a couple of times. It was a fascinating place to be. And then this much more open, crazy, wild West Berlin. And you can see here the Brandenburg Gate, which now you could drive right through that, but you could see the wall went right in front of it. That was the split between West Berlin and East Berlin. You know, the Brandenburg Gate, you probably are aware that Bach wrote these very famous things called the Brandenburg Concerti. It was tied to this. Here's the political changes. When Germany was Nazi Germany, it was a unitary state. With a unitary state, the local and regional governing bodies do not have significant decision-making power. All the decision-making power is held in the central government. After the war, we flipped West Germany, and then ultimately all of Germany, into the system that we have in the United States, which is a federal state. With the federal state, the local, regional governing bodies have significant decision-making powers. And of course, this is the way our government works. Although we have a strong central government, of course, the states make their own laws, and then counties make their own laws, and cities make their own laws. Now, it's all under the umbrella of our Constitution, but nevertheless, not every state has the death penalty. This is something that's left up to the states. That's federalism. And then, of course, there are psychological things. Although there are strong and vocal anti-immigrant sentiments, and there are, and they are directed overwhelmingly at these people who came as Gastarbeiters and then the recent immigration of Muslims from the Middle East. This comes largely from former East Germans. The West Germans don't have this thing running through them. But when the wall collapsed and communism fell apart in Eastern Europe and the two Germanys became one single country, East Germans really thought that they were going to be as rich as West Germans. And it was going to happen just like that overnight. But it did not happen like that. Their factories closed, their businesses closed, and they were out of work. A country that had basically 0% unemployment went to 10% unemployment with 30% unemployment in Eastern Germany. And the result of that was there began to be very strong anti-immigrant sentiments coming overwhelmingly from the East. Nevertheless, there's no interest by the Germans in aggression towards foreign countries the way there had been in the 20th century. I think they probably learned their lesson. It acts in a lot of ways as the great cautionary tale, what happened to them during World War II and what they did to other people during World War II.